Welcome to the second day of the Ending the Korean War Symposium. I am Lisa Lowe, a professor at Yale University, where we're pleased to host the collective. I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors, the programs in American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, Ethnicity, Race and Migration, and Film and Media Studies, the Departments of History and East Asian Languages and Literatures, the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, the Whitney Humanities Center, and the John and Dorothy Kempf Fund. Thank you also to my colleagues with whom I've collaborated and consulted as we've organized this at Yale, Kyung-hee Yo, Sunny Shang, Min Vu, and Adi Kumar, and also to Keith Masadra and Aaron Green for their assistance. Today, the symposium features two sessions. The first is an exciting panel on racialized markers of difference in war, such as military uniforms, tattoos, and disease. And the final session is a conversation between the collective and invited scholars examining the links between US wars in the Philippines, Korea, and Southeast Asia. As with yesterday, the webinar is being recorded and we will spotlight the speakers for each session. We recommend selecting speaker view in the upper right corner for best reception. You may submit questions in the Q&A box, which will appear for some of you on the bottom bar, and a member, or could be under the dots where it says more, and a member of the EKW collective will review the questions and, time permitting, will pose them at the end of the panel. Finally, a reminder that the Zoom link for this morning will also be the Zoom link for this afternoon. So let's turn now to our first session, Second Skin, the Anti-Communism of Tattoos and Uniforms in the Korean War.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Hong. I am a core member of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective. And before beginning, I just want to express the collective's gratitude to Lisa Lowe for inviting us to organize this two-day symposium at Yale. And this virtual symposium was actually 4 years in the works, and there were numerous conversations, planning discussions, and were it not for Lisa's steadfastness, I don't believe that we would be here gathered today as we are. So our profound gratitude to Lisa for steering this forward. Thank you also for Min for helping to administrate today's session. And also I wanted to mention that there are other members of the collective who are not actually, they don't necessarily have speaking time here, but behind the scenes have helped out in innumerable ways. So I wanted to say that the idea behind today's session was really thinking about the ways, far from obvious, even as they were visible, that the Korean War served as the grounds for the recoding of the logic of race. And part of this conversation is a response to the idea, the idea that somehow in the wake of World War II, there was a decisive racial break. And of course, this is Howard Winant's term. And that this racial break essentially meant that overt white supremacy could no longer serve as a ruling idea in the wake of Nazism. And to no small degree, when Barack Obama has stated that the Korean War was a victory, a civil rights victory, because integrated units, US forces were desegregated on the Korean War fronts. Because of this, he has stated that the Korean War was a victory. To no small degree, that actually accords with Winant's racial break thesis. Yet in what ways did the context of imperialist war, of a war, an asymmetrical war of US intervention in which 4 million people were killed, in which the concept of the area target was expanded to create vast group differentiated vulnerability to death. In what way was race getting recoded in militarized terms? And so part of our conversation and the planning of this was thinking about how, as Mimi Nguyen has pointed out, there are technologies of repression that make difference visible. And she doesn't use the term second skin, that is our term. She uses the term surrogate for flesh to think about how um, uh, there's a racial colonial optics at play. And there, these militarized modes of perception sift racialized subjects who are an undifferentiated mass into good or bad, with us or against us. And so part of this is thinking about militarized biopolitics and their far-reaching implications into the present. And so with that, I'd like to pass things over to Sungun.
Hey everyone. Today, in my portion of the talk, I'm going to somewhat ambitiously try to question in the 8 minutes that I have the uncritical celebration of the Korean War as the first time that the U.S. armed forces was desegregated, as a kind of a celebration of a moment in which there was a civil rights gain, and this kind of representation that equality and freedom and a democratizing enterprise was represented by minority soldiers and through desegregation in the Korean War. And in particular, I would like to look comparatively on the one hand, what you see on the right side are reports and assessments on the segregated all-Black 24th Regiment under the 25th Infantry Division in the Korean War. And what you see on the left, which is the research that I am currently conducting, and the so-called successful racial integration of indigenous Korean soldiers, South Korean soldiers, into US military echelons, who are widely known as KATUSIS, or the Korean augmentation troops to the US Army. These groups of Korean soldiers are not really well known within US history, unfortunately, and sorry, I don't have a slide here to show a picture. I do for a later session, but I can conjure up a vivid imagery, and I should disclose at this point that I served out my South Korean conscription as one of these soldiers, right? So these Korean soldiers, upon the outbreak of the Korean War, when manpower in the military was depleted within US Imperial Army and its intervention, were pulled and abducted. And I'm not making up these words here. These are words that are coming out straight from US Military Archive, right? They were given US military uniforms. And this sort of successful integration, right, in contrast or in antithesis to the segregated policies of segregating minority soldiers, has been celebrated not just within Korean War history, but to this present day, right? So these Katusa soldiers continue to occupy this peculiar space in US military bases in South Korea today, right? Although they are serving irrefutably a foreign force, right? And I want to contrast these two notions of integration and segregation and show how the Korean War, far from the touted watershed moment of a break from the colonial past in which we're moving towards desegregation and civil rights, was actually a recalibration of colonial logics and minority soldiering that are deeply entrenched in the histories of not just US colonialisms, but colonialisms across the globe. And I should point out here that, you know, our module syllabus is called the Korean War as a racial project. And there is a racial, actual physical sort of racial projects that are going on here, right? In 1951, precisely because despite President Truman's Executive Order 9981 that called for the desegregation of US armed forces in 1948, this was met with adverse and strong resistance, not just from politicians in Washington, D.C., but also within the military, within the leadership of the US military, right? So the kind of unevenness that you see, or what is called an unevenness that you see, right? So Black soldiers were continuing in this first half of the Korean War in segregated uniforms, in segregated units, while Korean soldiers were being integrated. And this is what is being cried out here in this firefight at Yecheon by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bussey. And I want to spotlight the coloniality of archive and how we must actually putting these two minority soldiers side by side and looking at the whiteness and the coloniality of the archive is essential to doing a critical history of the Korean War. So Bussey here is making an outcry that the US Army's official history of the first part of the Korean War by Roy E. Appleman. And his book suggests that the Negro soldiers and their units were no good. Mr. Appleman interviewed only one Black soldier and no Black enlisted men. In some cases, these white officers may have provided self-serving accounts seeking to blame the troops for their own leadership failures. In the official history, the instances of bad performance by Negro troops appear to be emphasized more than similar behavior by white troops. And he also mentions that the kind of strangeness where they were willing to integrate the ROC, the Republic of Korean Soldiers, even though most Negroes were still continuing to be segregated. And it was in late September 1950, 2 months after the beginning of the Korean War, that Major General William B. Keane, commander of the 25th Infantry Division, called for the disbandment of the all-Black 24th Infantry Regiment, declaring that it is untrustworthy and incapable of carrying out missions expected of an infantry regiment. Keene's charges were not merely a battlefield assessment, but part of a long-standing pattern of racialized scapegoating within the US military, where Black troops were systematically denied the same resources, strategic support, and institutional respect that are afforded to white soldiers. And I want to point out here that, you know, and this is sort of in addressing a question that was posed today that we couldn't address yesterday, that how can we think about Black soldiering and minority soldiering, and what are the kinds of theoretical frameworks that we can think about within the study of US military empire and US imperialism? And I think it's not necessarily coming up with new theoretical frameworks, but revisiting these kinds of conventional understanding of frameworks such as segregation versus integration. Because what I noticed was actually these two are not antithetical to each other. What you see is that integrating Korean soldiers, some of them were integrated into segregated units. And of course, in the 25th Infantry Division, where the all-Black regiment are housed in, that's where the Koreans were also segregated into their own units, right? In other units, such as the 2nd Infantry Division or the 7th, they were promised equality. So they were paired up with their buddy counterparts, US counterparts, but put in that mode of tutelage, guidance, and assimilation that are typical of colonial soldiers. I also want to point out that integration was about building a multilateral coalition, right? And strangely, I found in the archives that Korean soldiers were not only attached to US military units, but remember that this was a so-called UN command. And so Koreans were only attached and adapted and racially integrated into white countries that had experiences of its settler colonialisms. So, for instance, the British, all of the British Commonwealth, the French, the Belgian, and you can read a bit more about this in existing scholarship that we've uploaded to the syllabus. But I want to, Madeline, could you go to the next slide? I think in the interest of time. So I want us to sort of, and I'm trying to lift up the primary sources that are on the syllabus here, that we have to really directly face the racism that pervades the Korean War battlefield, right? Look at the amount of Black soldiers that were court-martialed versus the number of white soldiers, right? So the ways in which Black soldiers are entirely blamed for the entire failure of what was really the US military, right? Or the ways in which, this was a very, what happened in Korea is an old story, old as Jim Crow, right? The story of sacrifice of Negro troops and the altar of segregation, right? But I also want to point out that, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. That we have to employ this kind of similar critical ethnic studies lens when analyzing the so-called integration of Korean soldiers that are celebrated for its equality and promise of freedom within the US military empire, right? Because the ways in which they are denigrated are very similar to the ways in which other minority soldiers, right? Korean soldiers are not alone, and they shouldn't be exceptionalized within as this kind of symbol of US ROK alliance. But instead, we have to critically think about them within the multi-ethnic contours of the US military empire. Okay, so I will leave it at this and pass on to the next person.
So I wanted to begin my part of this discussion by going back to research that I did some years ago, and observing back in the day that when Lieutenant Dan Choi came out during a time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he insistently showed up in virtually every single media arena that he was in uniform. In sites of protest, he showed up in uniform, although he had already been discharged. So the moment that he came out, he knew that he would be discharged, and he thereafter insistently showed up in uniform. And this insistence on uniform suggested that the story of coming out was not the story of the uncovered self. The uniform really played a kind of, it served as a certain kind of nationalist shield. And it also pointed to the role of the US military uniform as a form of post-racializing cover that in theory neutralizes difference. And here we can think about the critical race theorist, Letty Volpe, the legal scholar, who pointed out that in the wake of 9/11, people of color insistently draped their dwellings, their bodies, their workplaces with flags in an effort to demonstrate loyalty, with the flag serving as a kind of nationalist skin of sorts. And so, what I wanted to say is that in the course of a media tour, speaking about his willingness to come out during a time of don't ask, don't tell, Dan Choi stated that war is the force that gives us meaning. And he pointed to the fact that his mother, as a child, was an orphan during the Korean War, and that that context informed his own decision. And so I wanted to go here to the next slide. So the story of race and uniform is far from new. It's far from, it doesn't originate by any stretch of the imagination in the Korean War. You can see that during World War II, Claudia Jones indicted Jim Crow in uniform, not only pointing to the fact that troops were desegregated, but also questioning whether or not there was an identity of purpose in terms of Black soldiers and US war interests. But you could see that in the immediate wake of World War II, Dwight Palmer of Truman's Fahey Committee that oversaw the desegregation of US forces following Truman's executive order that someone spoke about, stated that, yes, okay, so what is the purpose of the uniform? He states the nation's manpower can't be used with maximum efficiency unless the armed services offer to all men in uniform equal opportunity to discover and exploit their capabilities. Basically, what the Fahey Committee reinforced time and again was that integration of the forces under the cover of a shared uniform was necessary to amplify the lethality of the US war machine. Could you go to the next slide? And so you could see here that in the Korean War, this was actually the last major US intervention in which the practice of child mascotry was tacitly condoned. Alongside animals, children were considered to be, and oftentimes adopted into units as mascots. And invariably, these child mascots, who were often perceived to be orphans, donned uniforms. And this kind of the uniform actually speaks to a queer legacy in this hot fighting period of militarized racial inclusion that included Black soldiers, that included Native Korean soldiers, and that included children as well, Korean children as well. And the headlines of newspapers during this time were always pointing to the fact that this is life-giving. This airman who adopts this Korean War mascot gives new life to this mascot. Other headlines read, clutched from the grasp of starvation and death. This is the sort of work that the uniform is doing. Saved by GI generosity. Troops give time, toil, money. And so these mascots were imagined as without kin, even if they did have it. They were imagined as stripped of prior social bonds, and they were made over in the occupier's image time and again, disrupting what others have called the semiotics of disloyalty that connected them, in theory, to the enemy. And so the uniform was essential to their racial securitization. And so can we go to the next slide? So you could see here on the left-hand side, this is from Stars and Stripes. This is a mascot who was given the nickname Sergeant Yo-Yo. And you could see how he was made over in the occupier's image. And on the right-hand side, I have been collecting Korean War albums for now over 20 years. And in these albums, you see mascots and houseboys in fatigues, in various kinds of military uniform, wearing, quote unquote, on the left-hand side, as Sergeant Yo-Yo is doing, what's called a cunt cap. And I would say also that there's something about the erotics of mascot and houseboy vulnerability that also raises to the fore what gets lost, I would argue, in Lieutenant Dan Choi's campaign, which is a queer legacy of racial securitization in which there was an erotics of vulnerability fundamentally at play. I'll pass it to the next person.
Thank you. Thank you, Sung-Eun and Christine. My name is Monica Kim. I'm a core member of the Ending Korean War Teaching Collective, and my most recent published work was a history of interrogation rooms during the Korean War as a way to tell the story of the Korean War kind of from the ground, and by doing so, really showing that the Korean War is really a struggle over decolonization. And for me as a historian of US empire and also what is happening in terms of warfare across the Pacific over the 20th century, I think that all of the collective's work on anti-communism is so key because the syllabus really gives us a way to think of anti-communism not as a Cold War trope, but truly and deeply as a colonial mechanism. And that's what I hope to kind of continue in my very brief presentation today. And I really want us to keep track of how anti-communism is a colonial mechanism that the US uses to constantly defer full sovereignty to Koreans. And then on the flip side, also the utility of anti-communism for the collaborator class in Korea. So I'd like to share, first of all, these two quotes from interviews conducted actually by the US military of two US military interrogators who were working during the Korean War. And as you'll see here, there's a racializing of the Korean by the US military that developmentally they could only understand violence, right? That they could not understand racial thinking, rational thinking, nor could they really be in a position to self-govern. And the very first quote you see here is about Koreans generally. The second one is important for us to note because it's actually about South Korean soldiers with whom US military troops were working. And we'll see that this racializing of the Korean as developmentally inferior and only being able to understand violence ends up being a justification exactly for this deferral of sovereignty, constant undermining of the demands for democratic self-governance from Koreans. It also justifies the violence that I saw happening within the interrogation rooms, and then certainly also for the mass violence and massacres against Koreans on the ground and also from the air. Madeline, could you go forward to the next? Yeah, thank you. So this photograph is actually the most circulated photograph by the United States of the supposed strange and violent rituals that were done by the Koreans. And ironically, we could say, this photograph is actually a photograph of a supposed anti-communist Korean POW. So for the US military, the tattoos were evidence of the less rational and thus more violent tendencies of the native Korean. But these tattoos actually were part of a longer claim to a racial and blood nationalism and sovereignty by the anti-communist POWs. So one thing that is very much not ever discussed by the US military is the fact that so South Korean soldiers who had been taken as POWs by North Korean troops, when the North Korean troops surrendered to US military troops, the US military decided that they couldn't differentiate between any of these Koreans. So they actually pipelined all of the South Korean soldiers directly to the POW camps, and they were behind barbed wire. Now, the reason why this is actually really significant for a photograph like this is that many of those South Korean soldiers had been members and leaders of Lee Seung-man's fascist paramilitary youth groups before the outbreak of the Korean War. And now they are being held as POWs in the POW camps of the Korean War. And so these tattoos, when I was looking at them, for me, these tattoos are not evidence of an irrational mind, unable to comprehend political discourse. What I found these to be was the creation of a different kind of an archive for warfare. And so what I mean by this is that the anti-communist POWs really wanted to undermine the power of the US military interrogation room. So they wanted to create their own form of interrogation, which involved tattooing. And to submit to a tattoo, the Korean POW was in effect declaring that they believed in the future reality and power of the Ri regime. And the anti-communist POW leaders were also claiming power and sovereignty over the body and political subjecthood of the Korean POW. And here, again, this is one of the things that I argue in the book. This is a really perfect example of a kind of fascist politics over the body, where the tattoo speaks louder than anything the Korean POW could say to US military officials. So the body of the Korean POW, although racialized by the US military, was weaponized and mobilized by the Korean anti-communist POWs. And then if, Madeline, if you could just, actually, let's go to the next slide, just in interest of time. So the tattooing practice for me as a historian, it really comes more into focus as a political practice when we look at kind of the larger archive that anti-communist POWs were attempting to create during the Korean War. What I have on these slides for you is an example of blood writing. These were part of a petition that anti-communist POWs had sent to Eisenhower to declare that they were not communists, so therefore they should no longer be held as POWs. But for me, I think the significance here, well, number one, each piece of paper is about as large as I am, which is about 5 feet. So this is an extraordinary amount of blood. And what becomes clear in these, in the blood writing is that these were always done in public, in the kind of the central public space of each POW compound. So the tattooing practice, when we kind of look at this alongside this blood writing practice, we see that it's about the performance, the public performance of either the tattooing or the blood writing that becomes very, very important here. And again, with the blood writing here, the anti-communist POWs are simply performing their politics for each other. And this is, again, thinking about how a kind of politics of anti-communism is so much about a kind of performance of a fascist collective aesthetics and work. Madeline, if you could just go to the next one. What's very interesting, though, is that, again, when we go back to the US military archive, though, is that there's an absolute conflation of the anti-communist tattoos and with what the communist Korean POWs were fashioning in their own compounds. So they have photographed this particular POW in front of a collection of weapons that the US military had gathered from a communist Korean compound. So again, kind of conflating those two things. But what's really important about this conflation, again, using the weapons that were constructed by communist Korean POWs as the background for this anti-communist POW with tattoos, is this entirely erases the fact that mass death and mass violence that was actually enacted at any point of time during the war in these POWs camps were actually done by the US military or by gunfire from South Korean soldiers. So for example, one of the biggest moments of mass death and massacre happened when communist Korean POWs refused to allow US interrogation teams into the compound. The US military threw in grenades, and then there was full-on gunfire done by South Korean soldiers. And at the end of that, 74 Korean POWs had died. And so again, this kind of both complicit erasure by South Korean fascist paramilitary youth groups and by the US military of the real violence and colonial violence of the Korean War. Thank you.
Hello. Just 1 second, please. So as the speakers before have been speaking, have been illuminating, in the climate of Cold War institutionalized colorblindness, the Korean War served as a testing ground of US war machines shifting racial politics, where the racialization of ideology and belief were mapped onto previous racial forms. Moreover, racial significations collided, morphed, and synthesized in unruly ways. So the question happens, what happens to gendered racialized skin? And there have been accounts of comfort women and tattoos. And of course, when we're saying tattoos, we're not talking about professional tattooing. We're talking about the way that these bodies have been mutilated by drawing supposed maps through cigarette burns, through knives, through nails. And the question is, why did violation take this form? Why did the killability of Asian women as supposed war trash take this form of drawing, scribbling on them as if they were bathroom stalls? Why did the gendering of skin take this race technology of tattooing? And we can partially think about this in terms of the importance of remasculinization or ownership or authorship in a time of insecurity and permanence. Such because tattoos are, as Monica has pointed out, the permanence of them. They speak louder than what the voice can say, right? So instead of going into historical archives, well, partially because I'm not a historian, but also because I wanted to point to the complex network of different racial significations that are going on at this moment. I'm going to look at very briefly Moon Sung-tae's Moonshin의 땅, or Land of Tattoos, which was published in 1987. So for those of you who know Korean history, this is the year of the June Uprising, the nationwide pro-democracy movement in South Korea that generated mass protests against the military dictatorship of Chon Do-won, who, of course, as you know, was the author of the Gwangju Massacre and Uprising in 1980. So this novella was nominated for the Yisang Literary Award, which again was won that year by Lee Mun-yeol's Our Twisted Hero, which is a very important, controversial in many different ways text, which was a political allegory on totalitarianism. So unlike Lee Mun-yeol's Our Twisted Hero, the
the spatial setting of this short story is not the classroom or the male-dominant patriarchal spaces, but whether the slums, right, that are spreading out across in the 1980s across this industrialized, gentrified landscape. And the novella centers around the figure of Maria, who's an ex-Camptown sex worker who lives in the slums with her Black Amerasian son, Pedro. So her Camptown past is engraved on her by tattoos made by American GIs who wanted to possess her. And she calls this 더러운 상처, 사랑의 상처, the scars of a dirty, shameful love. The literary text constantly draws parallels between Maria's body, the militarized land of South Korea, and the underlying violence of development and gentrification. And it draws a direct connection between the comfort women doing Japanese imperialism and the American military comfort women, or the Camptown women. So this is quite interesting at that point, because there was a kind of dualism between comfort women doing the Japanese imperialism as being pure victims of imperialism versus Camptown women as being morally or sexually loose women. In this short story, it actually questions precisely that type of dichotomy. So in going back to the diegesis of the story, just as Maria wants to erase her tattoos to die pure, South Korean society wants to leave behind its past. And this becomes especially clear in the description of the temporal asymmetry between the sprawling shantytown on the hill, where Maria and Pedro live, with the high-rise apartment complex facing it. So there's this constant saying of, oh, we are 1980s Korea, but they still live in the 1950s Korea. So the slum bypassed by urban development not only mars the modern cityscape, what is called a malign tumor on the body of development and prosperity, but it also painfully reminds one of the war-ravaged and poverty-stricken 1950s that middle-class Korean people living in the neighboring apartment complex don't want to look back on. But the shantytown proclaims its presence with a vengeance to the affluent residents' apartments, as if asking to be recognized as the inerasable, if uncomfortable, tattoos in the trajectory of modern Korean history. So Maria's tattoos are doubly shameful in this context, as a violation and transgression of gender purity, but also as a constant presence of camptowns and as constant reminder of the unending Korean War. So as Chung Jung Lee writes, and I quote, camptowns became the sites of an embarrassing past present for the hyper-developmentalist society, unquote. So what I want to gather from this short story are three major points. So recalling Kyuri Jeon's Flesh Witness, which many of you viewed yesterday, how to think of flesh and skin as both witness and archive through which we might trace the messiness of history, where skin acts as a site as S-I-T-E, a site as in vision, S-I-G-A-T, where racial, national, gendered, and ideological meanings collide, and where the legacies of war, imperialism, and capitalism are written on the body. And then the second point is precisely the contradictory anti-Blackness that this story illuminates. So according to Moon Sung-tae's story, the tattoos of Black American GIs are the most deep and dark, the most violent, which in many ways contradicts the actual accounts of Camptown women. But and at the same time negate that there was any real intimacy between Maria and the Black men who supposedly tattooed her. But then there's a figure of her son, Pedro, who embodies unconditional love. He refuses to go to the US, refuses to be adopted because he wants to live with his mother. And then the third point is questioning the teleological narrative of Korean history as one from war-ravaged nation to economic powerhouse. So the question of development rises. So what is development? On what land and upon whose bodies and skin does this development take place? And precisely the novella actually figures that development refashions war. It is not the end of war, but a refashioning precisely of war. Madeline, can we go to the second slide, please? So this is a photo by the Young Seok-gang, who was who actually took these photos as Cameroid. So unlike the kind of National Geographic or auteur-like photos, these photos oftentimes were commissioned either by the American soldiers or even by the Camptown women. So they show this in a very different light, not necessarily just as victims and abusers, but as very contradictory and messy kind of relationships that most people occur. And in this, what we see is a Camptown woman who dons an afro. And I think for many of us who are Korean historians, we've seen these, or Korean studies scholars, we've seen these photos. But when I showed this to a friend, my friend was like, wow, she has an afro. What is up with that? And again, we think precisely about the afro, the skin, the different ways that militarization and racialization collide precisely in this very militarized and messy network of spaces. So through tattoos that show the correlation between war, militarization, and gendered racial violence, we can see how the Korean War became a laboratory for a new form of racialization that expanded, exceeded, and obscured color line divisions. And precisely speaking about these women, so within the camp towns, there was a de facto segregation, right? Where women who worked with or serviced Black men were separated from women who serviced white soldiers, right? And this is actually even true up to very recent times, where there's a de facto segregation between the different clubs and bars that the soldiers, whether you're white, Black, Latino, etc., go to. And quoting here is Jung Jung Lee's, right? The experience of race in which the Camptown sex workers' own race becomes conflated with their sex work is critical. So women who worked with Black men were seen precisely as not the same kind of, can we say, hierarchy of humanity as those who worked with white men. And I want to quote Christine here, where she talks about how Camptown women's bodies were actually Jim Crowed, right? Thinking precisely about this. But looking again at this photo, I want to ask the question of how we can think precisely about the potentiality of Black Korean solidarity against the white supremacy of US militarism. What is the insurgent intimacy that we can actually trace or think about or fabulate in this context? So what kinds of fugitive creativity and radical imagination emanate from the shadows of horrific violence provoked by the unending Korean War? Places and peoples that have been expunged and forgotten in the shadows of state memory and official archives become the present absence that summons its own insurgency, its own way of feeling, its own way of knowing. I will pass the baton to Madeline.
Hi, I'm Madeline. I'm a PhD student in American Studies at Yale, and thank you to all the previous speakers. In a way, this presentation will be a kind of precursor to what Junyoung spoke about with regards to the short story and the photographs, but I'll also attempt to talk about the sort of collapse of the racialized body and racialized space in the form of the military base and the camp town that emerges around it. So on the screen, you can see that these are graphs that were published in Al Jazeera in 2020 that map the approximately 750 US military bases that it maintains around the world. The US possesses the largest number of overseas military installations out of any nation in the world, as many of us know, South Korea being among its chief ally nodes in this empire of bases. So today, South Korea remains host to approximately 73 US military installations, each of which operates as these kinds of palimpsestic landscapes that Junyoung spoke to, indexing layered histories of overlapping empires and the ongoing afterlives of occupational violence. So while the end of World War II is often narrated as a liberation of South Korea from Japanese colonial rule, we know that the US military immediately reoccupied Korea, maintaining colonial strategies aimed at repressing labor, quashing dissent and communist elements, and sustaining the subjection of Korean women to militarized sexual violence. So the photos that you're seeing on the screen are of their contemporary photos from Americatown, which is a former US camp town in Kunsan. And these areas around US military bases saw the emergence of businesses like eateries, tailoring shops, bars, and clubs catering to US soldiers as their primary clientele. These were also spaces of highly gendered labor. Korean women would obtain jobs on US military bases as clerks, typists, and notably in surrounding areas in these bars and clubs where soldiers paid, for drinks, company, and sexual services, as little as a pack of cigarettes. And these women were also regularly subjected, of course, to surveillance, discipline, and policing, not only by Korean madams and pimps, but also the Korean police and, chief of all, the U.S. Authorities. These women were also colloquially referred to as 미군 위안부, meaning literally U.S. military comfort woman, a term that illuminates the reality of U.S. occupation, not as a total break from Japanese imperialism, but instead as an extension of many of the structures of violence that were implemented during the colonial period. So while camp towns are often called and treated as little Americas, as somewhat isolated and exceptional in the context of the larger geographical and cultural context they occupy, like the POW camp, such spaces of exception, in fact, illuminate the normative logics that prop up the normative mode of governance that extend far beyond the spatial boundaries of the camp. So as Catherine Moon has written about, the surveillance and policing of Korean camptown women really hit a fever pitch in the 1970s, triggered by the Nixon Doctrine, in which as a reaction to which the Park Chung-hee regime, which had become highly dependent on U.S. aid, sought to stave off the troop withdrawal proposed under Nixon by attempting to address a number of issues, so-called issues that the United States had identified in Korean military camp towns, including disturbances in race relations, particularly as manifested through the system of separate bars and clubs for Black and white soldiers, as well as the transmission of venereal disease among American soldiers. So what you're seeing on the screen are two periodical screenshots from an English language newspaper from the year of 1971 that covers the racial uprising that year that happened in Angjeongri, which is in Pyeongtaek, currently home to the largest overseas U.S. military base in the world, in which 50 Black soldiers entered local camptown bars and nightclubs on the charge that these establishments discriminated against Black soldiers. As a result, the U.S. placed a near 50-day ban on these businesses, displacing the blame for racial tensions entirely onto local Koreans while simultaneously disavowing its own homegrown racism. Domestic racism was also inscribed onto the Korean women who worked in these clubs, with women who worked in, for example, white bars, facing the threat of beatings or loss of business at the hands of white soldiers should she decide to service Black clientele. So the shifting of blame for the responsibility for these instances of camptown unrest fell most disproportionately on these women who were caught in the crosshairs of U.S. militarism as racism and South Korean patriarchal nationalism. To improve the image of these camp towns, again, Park Chung-hee's regime implemented what is widely, I'm sure many of us know, known as the Camptown Cleanup Campaign in the 1970s, or Kijichon Chongwon Undong, targeted at addressing the spread of venereal disease, but rather than working through the responsibility that the U.S. military bore for this kind of spread, again, the blame for this fell on Korean women who were subjected to heightened policing and were round up and subjected to forcible treatment as they were treated as agents of contagion, aka they were considered or called to be bad women. So what you're seeing on the slide here is an image of what became known in that period as monkey houses, which were essentially medical prisons where Korean women who worked in camp towns were detained and incarcerated and subjected to forcible penicillin injections, often containing dangerously high doses that left these women with lifelong health problems, if not led to their deaths. The name for these monkey houses came from the image of women hanging from the bars placed on these windows of these camps, which you can actually still see are standing in this photograph, preventing them from leaving as they were forced to withstand the pain of these injections. So this particular monkey house building is located in the city of Dongducheon, which is about 1.5 hours north of Seoul. It's the last standing building of its kind, as the others have since been razed to the grounds after they were rendered inoperative. Local activists and residents in Dongducheon and Gyeonggi Province have been staging protests to prevent the building from being demolished by the local city government. And the reason that it's significant that this stands in Dongducheon is because the city became widely known in South Korea and the diaspora in the October of 1992 when a Korean sex worker named Yoon-mi was brutally assaulted and murdered by USGI Kenneth Markle there. This was not the only case of its kind by far, but it would become the first case of a U.S. military personnel who was tried and prosecuted in a Korean court at the time, which really resulted from local organizers pushing for redress for Yoon's murder. So though Dongducheon is often remembered as the city where this kind of murder played out, becoming known as one of Korea's most notorious U.S. military camp towns, local organizers there have repeatedly pointed out during protests to preserve this building that we should also remember Dongducheon as the core of the Korean movement against U.S. military occupation that continued to spread through the nation in the 1990s. So currently, the local government doesn't actually have a designated plan for how the land will be used if the facility building ends up being razed. At one point, local politicians even mused about turning it into a parking lot. But the organizers who are protecting the building from destruction want to turn it into a peace museum that not only commemorates the Korean women who worked in Dongducheon and their stories, but that might also serve as a testament to the South Korean state's complicity in facilitating sexualized U.S. military violence and to ensure that this is not forgotten. So to wrap up, since last summer, the organizers have built and sustained an encampment actually in front of the facility site, which is located at the base of a mountain called Soyosan. Today is their 165th day of camping out, as you can see in the extreme cold. And there have been people who are sleeping there every single night. So we are sending them our solidarity from here in the US. And this history of camp towns not only produced, Camptown women as subjects in need of disciplining by the state and who would be subjected to the twin violence of being additionally stigmatized for the association with the sex industry for the rest of their lives, but also created new categories of racialized subjects in need of rehabilitation and care, as Hosu Kim has argued, for example, in the form of the mixed race adoptee and through metaphors of disability. So with that, I'll pass it over to Carl.
Thank you, Madeline. Can you hear me? Yes, great. I would like to speak about second skin through the lens of contagion and disability. As Christine and other EKW members have noted here, I want to reiterate that the understanding the racial break and its implications for the Cold War is key to understanding the conflated relationships between race, communism, and disability. Expanding on the concept of racial break, I argue that the shift away from race as a strictly phenotypic category actually enabled the recording of race as disability. This ideological restructuring allowed the US to frame asymmetrical warfare not as a violent imposition, but as a form of humanitarian intervention. The once race was no longer perceived solely as a fixed biological difference, but could also be construed as a disability. The possibility of curative intervention emerged. Unlike the racial difference, which was seen as immutable, disease and certain disabilities were framed as potentially treatable. And this logic played a crucial role in Cold War ideology, like curability determined who could be saved and who could not. And within this framework, communism was understood as an untreatable condition, right? And US Cold War policy operated on a stark binary. Communists should die while anti-communists should leave, right? But however, disabled subjects complicated this binary. And those seen as physically or socially unfit, but not actively threatening yet, they are occupied a gray area as disabled. Madeline, can you, yes, next, thank you. And also these colder politics were deeply influenced by eugenics too. Eugenics was based on the belief that undesirable traits were inheritable and could be transmitted between subjects, right? And in this context, both race and disability were conceptualized as contagious. And just as eugenists believed that physical traits could be passed down biologically, colder rhetoric suggested that race and disability, like communism, could spread through populations. And this reinforced the need for containment and control. So during the Korean War time, as you can see from the slide, South Korean government spread leaflets warning that China had forcibly mobilized diseased and disabled individuals and sent them to South Korea, implying that the approaching communist Chinese army itself was infectious. This framing cast disabled populations as biological and ideological threats, reinforcing their status as targets of both medical and military interventions. Madeline, next slide, please. Yes, and Hansen's disease, leprosy, patients were directly implicated in this logic. In Cold War Korea, they were not only seen as public health risks, but also as ideological threats. In other words, their second skin isn't just something on the surface. It's an identity that's imposed onto a body, changing how it is perceived in a particular political and social context. In the Cold War, Hansen's disease patients weren't seen merely as patients. Instead, colder rhetoric redefined them as ideological threats, directly linking their disease and disability to communism. So when you see this like news article here, 1950s US news article titled "Reds in Korea Have Leprosy," quoted by like a very famous doctor at the time, who forcefully claimed that cases of leprosy have turned up in the disease-ridden forces of the Chinese and North Korean communists. This rhetoric forced a symbiotic relationship between the new ideological enemy, communism at the time, and an existing medical condition, Hansen's disease in South Korea. And more problematically, it blurred the distinction between disease and political identity, positioning Hansen's disease patients not just as infected, but as communists as well. This was a pivotal moment in Korean history. It was the first time that Hansen's disease patients were officially categorized as disabled rather than simply diseased. And the US military government capitalized on this shift, framing its medical aid to Hansen's disease patients as an extension of Cold War humanitarianism. Through this lens, Hansen's disease patients were portrayed as curable communists, a rare exception in an ideological landscape that otherwise deemed communists irredeemable. And when you see on the photo in the right side, this depicts a US military unit visiting a leprosy camp on Christmas Day. The presence of Santa Claus suggests a humanitarian gesture, right? But if we look closely at the patient's face in the center of the image, what does this expression reveal about the nature of cure and care under the Cold War humanitarianism? At least to me, this expression might suggest like kind of an uncertainty or even skepticism about the so-called humanitarian care. It forces us to reconsider what care really meant under Cold War politics. Was it truly benevolent, or was it a strategic tool to ideological containment? Next slide, please. And I want to highlight one final case that illustrates the direct consequences of this rhetoric. The poet Han Ha-un, Hansen's disease patient, poet, and disability justice activist. Han Ha-un wrote poetry in an era of extreme violence against Hansen's disease patients, excavated by anti-communist paranoia. During this period, a rumor circulated that North Korean spies disguised themselves as Hansen's disease patients by amputating their body parts.
This fear led to real consequences. For instance, Han Ha-won was falsely accused of being a communist after writing a poem about the pain of losing part of his finger to Hansen's disease. On the right, you can see the text of his poem, 손가락 한 마디, one joint of a finger. The line reads, during the cold winter, scratching like my head, lost one part of the finger, sadness of my situation. And Han Ha-won was not, then this kind of poetry make him being accused as a communist, and this became a like very big national issue at the time. And Han Ha-won was not the only one who was categorized as communist because of his disease and disability. Many Hansen's disease patients were executed as suspected communists. One particular case occurred in 1950 in Mulmuli. Local elites seeking to expel patients from the region falsely accused them of being communist spies. As a result, 28 Hansen's disease patients were massacred. This wasn't just one of many massacres committed against patients since the 1950s, and government-led or government-sanctioned massacres, forced sterilization, and other human rights violations against patients continued for decades. And so because of that, to this day, patient activists and advocate groups are fighting for justice, demanding government accountability, official recognition of these crimes, and meaningful reparations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kal. And I just wanted to give a minute or two for anyone to add questions in the Q&A for our discussion today. But as we wait for perhaps some more questions, I wanted to open it up to my inspiring collective members. Would any of you like to talk about kind of the experience of creating the specific second skin section for the syllabus and what you were hoping people could really take away from it, just in terms of like very, kind of short takeaways, let's say?
Monica, you know this so well. We actually have an entire syllabus that we have the bones of an entire syllabus. And what we have been doing with these events and with collaborations with community partners and among ourselves, and sometimes with other scholars who come in and other people who are doing work, is that we build it out. And so this, Lisa's invitation to actually, actually publish this module, which had been waiting in the wings, gave us an opportunity to work together. And so part of this was our coming together to have conversations about how we understand how race and the logic of race was getting transmuted during the Korean War. And with so many people doing different work, your incredible work. I mean, thinking about the racism of anti-communism and thinking about the racism of US militarism and imperialist war, this in a way, I guess it's part of our process is also engaging with the fact that within the United States, there isn't really a prevalent sense that anti-Asian racism has any structural basis. So like in this way too, like using the Korean War, which is often held out as a civil rights milestone, retrieved in that way, it seemed incumbent on us to think about the ways in which the logic of race was there. Group differentiated vulnerability to death is everywhere. There's militarized, there's a kind of militarized biopolitics that people don't pay attention to. And so part of this was us coming together, having conversations, as a collective, all of us, and then starting to build out a living open access syllabus, which we hope, to answer Megan's question, can be of use to many different publics, including K through 12. And so, yes, you may have to, Megan, I would say, selectively choose what's there. But we're also happy to be in conversation with you. So when you say that you do counter recruitment and you think that there could be, like, you would like to collaborate, we are ready to do so.
And I think the really powerful thing that comes through from this session is that just the sheer, how deeply, right, the transmutation of race that is happening as a military and imperial imperative during the Korean War, just where it goes, right? And that it doesn't have to be in a site, it's not in sites of warfare, in fact, right? All everyday sites have been transformed into sites of warfare, right? Precisely through these dynamics of race. It was just very, very, for me, it was very powerful to listen to everybody's presentations, to kind of think of this entire constellation and landscape.
I think another part that was really important for us was precisely to think about the structurality of racism and militarism. There's a common understanding that we know what racism is, and at the same time, we don't have the language for it. We know what race is, but we don't know what it is. And then we can just say it's a construction. Oh, okay, it's a construction, but what are the material practicalities and infrastructures of it? What are the manifestations of it? And these are things that we kind of naturalize in terms of, oh yes, US empire, militarism, race, but then how are they actually structurally linked? And where, and as you mentioned, like the sites that we find them in, right, are not necessarily just the sites that you think you can find them in, right? So whether it can be, hairstyles, right? Whether it's tattoos, right? Whether it is in terms of like disability, whether it's camp towns, right? In these different places and how they reverberate and what kind of consequences they have for the present, I think is really, really strong for us, right? And I think yesterday when we were talking about the Atlanta spa shootings, right? What we're speaking about precisely here gets manifested in that violence, right? In that, present contemporary violence against Asian women.
Junyoung, just to respond to that too, it's, when you look at some of the archival materials like the Pittsburgh Courier and other US Black newspapers, you see a kind of critique that racism in its export, to Asia through the US military has ensured that Asians will imbibe the kind of will imbibe the prejudices of common to white supremacy, and there's a sense that Asians will sort of learn their lessons in power from the white supremacy that gets disseminated around the globe. And it sort of positions Asian people as simply imbibing a kind of exported system of racism without understanding the racism of US militarism, of US military occupation, of US imperialist war. And what you speak about with regard to the camp town as a racialized space, you know, we can't understand anti-Asian racism, and this is common to, we all understand this, without understanding the racism of the fact that anti-Asian racism takes the form of sexual exploitation and the assumption of that of Asian women. And to also understand, like, you know, what your work is doing too, that Jun Young pointed to the Canton women who would don a fro during the Vietnam War era. You could see that throughout camp towns throughout Asia during that time. And Madeline, what your work shifts attention to is beyond the skin, that racial profiling or like the vulnerability of populations doesn't even have to do with like visual markers, be it a uniform, skin, tattooing, what have you, but actually has to do with where you're located.
And to give my fellow collective members a chance to read some of the questions that are coming in, I will say that perhaps another thing that this session can present to everybody who is joining us right now is one of the things that we really hope the syllabus could do is to provide many different entry points, right, into these questions. And I think that with all of the different presentations, that also really illustrates that, you know, the different ways to get at these questions about race, about gender, about militarization. Who's my fellow panelists? Would anyone like to? We have one question that is from somebody who's writing this as an anonymous participant. So, but it's a great question about, do you see, maybe I can put this into, do you see either Korean or US government acknowledging their deeds in the past? The current political state in the world seems to escalate into another Cold War with the recent surge of far-right political groups, and in general, largely due to the idea that accusing one's government of any inhumanitarian act is unnationalistic or unpatriotic. Do you see an outlet to bring changes? And kind of asking about how do we implement the things that are that the collective has brought together in the syllabus to thinking about other higher ed institutions or even secondary school curriculum, which I think is a great question. And again, just to echo what Christine was saying earlier, this is something that we very much, as we are creating the syllabus and rolling it out, that we want to be, and this is why it's so wonderful to have this particular platform through Yale, is that we can reach more people, partner with more allies, and think through how to get this to different classrooms. I myself, before going to graduate school, was a middle school teacher. And I was a middle school teacher right when 9/11 happened, and then the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. So the urgency is we are all feeling it. So for anyone who'd like to work with us in terms of thinking about how to translate this or to bring this to different organizations, especially at the secondary school level, we absolutely welcome that.
There's also a great question that was posed. I don't know if everyone can see them, so I put it in the chat. The question was about how we might think about racism in the context of South Korea's relations to and attitude toward North Korea and vice versa. And Monica, would you like to undertake that? Would anyone else here like to undertake that?
I'm so sorry. These are such great questions, and I'm just kind of reading them as they come in.
Well,
Just take a
I
quick look.
wonder, like we've talked and laughed about the fact that, it was a long-standing practice as part of the anti-communist pedagogy imposed on South Korean students that they had to participate in these anti-communist cultural contests where you would have to write poetry or draw images of the enemy North Korea. And I wonder if anyone here would like to talk about the kind of implicit racism of that. I mean, can people just describe them for, I can tell that many people who are in the audience are in the know, but I wonder for those who aren't, if Sunghoon, would you mind describing that Junyoung, yeah.
Well, can I actually address another question that actually came up yesterday and today? Is that okay?
Oh, are you going to shift topic?
Yeah. Or
Can you hold on a second and then yes, yeah.
So I think there's two ways to answer the question about thank you very much for the question, because I think it's a very, very important one. Is the South Korean racialization, for example, of North Koreans, or even to the ethnic Korean Chinese, right, which are the most criminally racialized population in South Korea now. So going back to the South Korean propaganda posters about North Korea or North Koreans are often depicted as these like monsters, green, red monsters that are like devouring. They're not even a human form monster. They're monsters that are like non-human like. And partially and obviously the whole question of like monstrosity is hinged on racialization, right? So the way that North Koreans become, the other or killable is precisely through distancing and saying, those are non-human. And this is the way that anti-communism becomes racialized itself, right? And the kind of anti-communist discourse precisely is on the racialization, not just of a political belief, but those who supposedly embody these political beliefs. Now, to the present day, if those of you like me are K-drama fans, this is what I do when I relax, is the very, very omnipresent representation of North Korean characters. And there's been kind of a change from, I would say, the 80s, 90s to the present, where many times during the 80s, 90s, the North Korean figure was actually in shadows. You didn't actually see them, right? They were kind of like film noir film, like in the shadows. And then there's a change with Shiri in the 2000 and to the present, where there's like Korean K-pop idols or very famous like A-list Korean actors who play North Koreans. But the way they play North Koreans is very interesting, right? They're painted way darker than South Koreans, right? There's an actual visual skin difference. And there's also like they look dirtier, right? There's one in Hwanghae and Yellow Sea where they're like eating like barbarians. And precisely this, I think, is fundamental when we think about racialization of North Koreans, right? Like, why are they always pictured as anachronistic, barbaric, as brown, black, right? And so I think, I don't know if I partially answered the question, but I think this is something that we need to keep thinking about.
Someone, would you like to close out by addressing what you wanted to speak to?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch upon, Madeline answered a question that might not be available for view for everyone. But there was a question yesterday about how can we think about solidarity between Black and Koreans? So in other words, how can we think about solidarity not just from radicalism from outside, but also from within? And I think this kind of rings a bell. Madeline, I think you replied that there were Black GIs who protested against, Vietnam War in within the setting of Korea, and there were certainly Koreans as well. But as I was taking part, as our collective and in drafting this syllabus, it really got me to think about how building solidarity also has to not just work outside of the military, but also within. In the sense that we have, for instance, at the university level, a lot of ROTC, cadets who take a class, for instance, for those of us who teach on Korea, right? So what if we taught about the Korean War in ways in which we are not just sort of, doing this old conventional historiography of origins of the Korean War, but what if we got them to think about the origin of us, right? And our relationality to Korea. And in some ways, I think because I served within the US military force, that, when you talk to these soldiers on one-on-one, that there is a kind of a way in which you can build solidarity and understanding and perhaps a rude awakening that even though sometimes when I encounter my colleagues in the academy at AAAS and others, and when we have soldiers come that turn up to sessions on Okinawa or other US military related sessions, that our sort of sense is to freak out, right? That the potentiality of intelligence and etc. But I think this is very much a reverberation of the Korean War as well, right? That as an academic, that we have an obligation and a responsibility to play. And of course, when I signed the petition against Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law, I remember my parents flipping out because they were so worried. Because, my dad's from Gwangju, my mom's from Yeosu, and the kinds of brutality with which people were massacred is a very much lived experience, right? And so I think there's a way to do a kind of critical reorienting of praxis of Korean War and to teach it critically that are available to us that we perhaps are not fulfilling. And I just wanted to point that out as a response to some of the questions that were raised yesterday and today.
Well, we want to thank my fellow collective members for this session, and we all want to thank everyone who has joined us for this session. And I would like to encourage everybody to meet here again in this virtual space of solidarity. And I have put the same Zoom link in the chat if people would like to save that for later. And we will all be returning here at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you to everyone who has joined us for the past hour and a half. Thank you.